around today, I mean, really look around, there is this very specific, undeniable sentiment that's just quietly building across society.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere right now.
Right. It's this profound, often unspoken sense of alienation, and it's felt by millions of men across modern institutions. And if you are listening to this right now, regardless of your background, chances are you have felt that friction, or you've at least seen it in the men around you.
Yeah, men who feel like the fundamental rules of the game, how to work, how to provide, how to simply exist in society, have just been aggressively rewritten overnight.
Exactly. They are actively seeking the historical roots of how academia, the media, corporate structures, how they seemingly shifted from valuing raw, competent output to, well, actively penalizing it.
You've noticed the narrative shift, and you're looking for answers.
So today, we are bringing you an exclusive, incredibly extensive, and frankly, a pretty challenging deep dive into an explosive new ebook that aims to provide exactly those answers. It's called Reparations Now. Victimology seeks to punish the dignified and honorable, and it's by Conrad Riker.
And I mean, it is a massive, incredibly dense piece of work. We are talking about 16 full chapters that essentially serve as this unified manifesto.
Yeah, it's a lot to get through.
It really is. Riker is attempting to map out a complete alternative worldview. He presents his highly aggressive, meticulously footnoted historical analysis of how global institutions were supposedly captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right.
And how those ideologies are explicitly designed to subjugate the men who physically maintain civilization.
But before we go any further, we do need to lay down a very clear mandatory disclaimer for you, the listener. We are acting purely as objective guides on this deep dive.
It's reporting the facts of the text.
Oh, exactly. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing the right-wing, anti-woke, or men's rights viewpoints presented in this book. Our mission today is simply to impartially report, unpack, and thoroughly analyze the fascinating, highly polarizing concepts contained within Riker's original source material.
Right. We want you to fully understand the architecture of his arguments, the history he cites, and the logic he uses without us, putting a thumb on the scale either way.
Yeah, we are dissecting the text. Our role is just to synthesize the massive amount of data Riker provides and explore the internal mechanics of what he is claiming. We're strictly relying on the historical events and the legal cases he actually brings to the table.
So keeping that purely analytical framework in mind, we want to make sure you have access to the source text to judge it for yourself.
Yes, please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you are streaming this deep dive right now. We highly recommend you check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Reparations Now, so you can actually follow along with us.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Frankpro on Substack.
That's right. You can also find his broader commentary on Twitter at Conrad Riker and on YouTube at Conrad Riker. So let's just plunge right into the material.
Let's do it.
Riker's book spans evolutionary biology, legal history, global economics, and cultural analysis. And he doesn't just start with abstract theory, right? He starts with this visceral, striking anecdote to introduce his central concept.
Yeah, he calls it the Iron Invoice.
The Iron Invoice.
No.
Tell us about that opening scene.
So he opens the book with a scene set in Pennsylvania. Riker describes standing in the blistering heat, right in the shadow of this massive industrial blast furnace.
Wow, okay.
And he asks the reader to truly observe the men working there. These are men whose hands are literally keeping the physical infrastructure of civilization intact. They're processing iron ore in hazardous, completely elemental conditions.
Right, so he's framing them not just as workers, but as the indispensable architects of the modern world.
Exactly. He demands the reader acknowledge the sheer physical toll required to maintain the baseline comfort of our society. And then he pivots sharply.
He contrasts that.
Yeah, he contrasts that grueling, high-stakes physical labor with what happened to those exact same men the very next week in a corporate conference room.
This is the DEI seminar part, right?
Yes. He describes a mandatory corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion seminar. According to the book, these men, who just days prior were literally risking their lives in a blast furnace, were forced to sit in folding chairs while a 20-something DEI facilitator, armed with a gender studies degree, lectured them on their innate privilege.
I mean, that's a jarring image.
It really is. Riker describes this facilitator demanding these industrial giants atone for their biological identity, basically framing their masculine traits as inherently oppressive.
And for Riker, this single localized moment is the genesis of his entire worldview. He views this as the unadulterated hypocrisy of a globalist system.
Yeah, he argues that our society relies entirely on masculine grit to function. Like the people who build a microprocessor, scale the high voltage power grids, maintain the sanitation systems. But while doing that, society is simultaneously creating a corporate culture that demands those exact same men grovel for forgiveness just for existing. He calls this unpaid debt for maintaining society the iron invoice.
And the way he describes the psychology of this dynamic introduces one of his most prominent recurring theories, which is the misandrist double bind.
Oh yeah, this is a huge part of his argument.
Right. If I'm reading his mechanism correctly, he is claiming that modern men are trapped in a sociological paradox where they are punished no matter how they behave.
Exactly. It's a lose-lose situation.
On one side, he brings in evolutionary psychology. He argues women are biologically hardwired via hypergamy to seek out strong, dominant, stoic men. If a man lacks that traditional masculine edge, he is biologically discarded in the mating market.
Right. But on the corporate and social side, if he actually projects that raw, unapologetic strength, he is immediately demonized by progressive society as a purveyor of toxic masculinity.
It's crazy. Riker posits that the modern institutional system is essentially demanding that men commit psychological and reproductive suicide.
He spends an entire chapter deconstructing the modern progressive push for men to be more vulnerable. In Riker's view, opening up emotionally is not a virtue at all. He says it is a fatal trap.
Wait, a trap? How does he mean?
He argues it is a mechanism designed solely to secure male submission. When men display vulnerability in the modern dating market or, the corporate boardroom, they believe they are following the new rules.
Right, doing what they're told.
Exactly. But Riker claims that in reality, their vulnerability is instantly perceived as weakness, and that weakness is weaponized against them to strip them of their authority.
It reminds me of someone downloading a mandatory software update for their phone, only to realize the new code is actively melting the motherboard.
That's a perfect analogy for what he's saying.
Society is pushing this behavioral software update, telling men to be soft, yielding, and highly emotive, that is fundamentally incompatible with the evolutionary hardware of both sexes.
Yeah, and Riker doesn't just stick to the modern corporate seminar to prove this. He pulls heavily from history to calculate the sheer scale of this iron invoice. Like, he points to the Wright brothers and their 1903 patent for the flying machine.
The Wright brothers, why them specifically?
Well, he uses them as the ultimate case study of isolated patriarchal brilliance. Humanity existed for hundreds of thousands of years looking at the sky, entirely bound to the earth.
Right.
Riker points out that it was the obsessive, risk-taking, hyper-focused systematizing of two men that conquered the air. They didn't do it by consensus, or by a committee.
Who just built it.
Exactly. They did it through dangerous, relentless physical experimentation. And he uses this technological triumph to pivot right into a deep critique of international law.
Because he links that localized innovation to the 1883 Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property, right?
He does. Originally, the Paris Convention and subsequent intellectual property treaties were designed to protect the sovereign rights of the creator. Basically, if you built it, you owned it.
Makes sense.
But Riker argues that over the last century, globalist institutions have warped these international mechanisms. He claims they have effectively socialized Western innovation, systematically stripping inventors of their sovereign intellectual property under the guise of the global good.
So Riker's argument is that this technology, whether it's aviation, pharmaceuticals, digital infrastructure, it was a lease to the rest of the world, not a gift.
Yes, a lease.
And he argues the globe has violently defaulted on the terms of that lease by demonizing the very demographic that generated the wealth in the first place.
That is the core of his historical argument.
But, there's a gap here that Riker has to cross. If we accept his premise that the industrial bedrock of society is fundamentally at odds with modern progressive sensibilities, how did the corporate world actually manage to enforce this behavioral shift?
That's the big question.
Right, because companies exist to make a profit. They don't just willingly sabotage their own efficiency and alienate their most productive workers for the sake of an abstract ideology, unless there is a mechanism forcing their hand. So how does Riker explain the compliance of the entire corporate sector?
He explains it through legal weaponization. Riker argues that you cannot understand the modern workplace without mapping the specific legal architecture that subjugated it.
Okay, so where does he say it started?
He traces the origin of this corporate capture to a piece of legislation that most people consider basically untouchable. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the subsequent creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC.
Now, he readily acknowledges that this was sold to the American public as a necessary, noble anti-discrimination measure to ensure fairness, doesn't he?
He does acknowledge its original branding, yeah, but he argues its enforcement apparatus was almost immediately hijacked by what he terms the gynocentric state.
The gynocentric state.
Yeah. Riker's core thesis here is that the EEOC stopped being a shield against discrimination and became a sword used to penalize natural male behavior. He claims the administrative state began classifying inherent masculine traits like aggressiveness, risk-taking, blunt and direct communication, hierarchical competition.
They classified all that as liabilities.
Exactly. And he tracks this legal mutation through a series of highly specific Supreme Court cases.
Let's unpack the mechanics of those cases because that is where his argument gets very granular. He points heavily to the 1986 case, Meritor Savings Bank v. Vinson.
Yeah, Meritor is a massive fulcrum in Riker's legal timeline. That was the Supreme Court case that officially recognized hostile work environment sexual harassment as a violation of Title VII.
Okay.
On paper, it was meant to protect employees from severe abuse. But Riker argues the legal standard of what constitutes a hostile environment was inherently subjective and was just quickly warped.
So how did it get warped, according to...
He claims it created a legal trap, where a man's naturally assertive communication style, or his demand for high-stress competence, could simply be reclassified by a female subordinate as a microaggression or a hostile environment.
I see.
Suddenly, HR departments were given the legal cover to purge demanding men from leadership roles just to avoid liability.
And he argues that net widens significantly with the 1998 Supreme Court ruling in Oncali v. Sundowner Offshore Services, right? Because that case expanded harassment laws to include same-sex harassment.
This is where Riker believes the final nail was put in the coffin of the traditional male workplace. In Oncali, the court ruled that Title VII's protection against workplace discrimination applied to harassment between members of the same sex.
Right.
According to Riker, the moment that precedent was set, human resources departments across the country weaponized it to outlaw male-on-male competitive banter.
Outlaw banter.
Yeah. He argues that men build trust, establish hierarchy, and forge bonds through primal camaraderie. Rough and tumble interactions, aggressive teasing, pushing each other's limits.
Yeah, that kind of locker room or job site dynamic.
Exactly. Riker states that this vital psychological mechanism for male bonding was criminalized overnight by HR bureaucracies. They were just terrified of litigation.
So if you're listening to this and you work in a corporate environment, Riker's interpretation of these legal milestones completely inverts the standard narrative of workplace evolution.
Completely inverts it.
He isn't describing a workplace that became more civilized. He's describing a workplace that was sterilized of the very energy that drives innovation. And he claims this transition from a meritocracy to a compliance culture has real-world physical consequences today.
It does. He brings us directly into the modern era to demonstrate the physical dangers of prioritizing ideology over competence. Riker spends a significant amount of time analyzing the diversity flight deck audit trend in the commercial aviation industry back in 2023.
Oh, the aviation industry. This is a crazy example.
It is. He cites instances where major airlines, terrified of progressive backlash and just desperate to meet diversity quotas, began restructuring their pilot training programs. Riker argues these corporations effectively began prioritizing a candidate's skin color or gender identity over their actual logged flight hours and spatial reasoning test scores.
Which is terrifying when you think about it.
He states bluntly that gravity does not care about your intersectional privilege, and that compromising the strict masculine standard of technical competence in aviation actively puts human lives at risk just to satisfy a PR initiative.
He also looks at the economic devastation this ideology causes to legacy brands, too. He dedicates a section to the massive corporate fallout of April 2023, specifically the Bud Light and Dylan Mulvaney marketing disaster.
Yeah, the Bud Light boycott.
Yeah, and Riker frames this not just as a bad marketing campaign, but as a symptom of a deeply sick corporate culture. Here you had a legacy brand willfully alienating its fiercely loyal working-class male consumer base to appease a microscopic, hyper-progressive fraction of the population.
And the result was a historic, multi-billion-dollar stock crash.
Exactly. It makes you wonder why any rational executive would greenlight a campaign that actively insults the people who actually buy the product. It feels like Riker is describing ESG mandates these environmental, social, and governance scores pushed by asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard as a sort of digital mafia protection racket.
Right, like pay the ideological toll, feature the correct progressive messaging, or we downgrade your stock and unleash the digital mob.
Is that exactly how he frames it?
Riker doesn't just hint at that analogy, he explicitly formalizes it. He argues corporate wokeness is never driven by genuine morality from the C-suite. It is entirely a cowardly protection racket.
Protection racket.
Yes, executives pay this ideological toll to globalist institutions specifically to avoid being targeted by radical left activists.
Oh, wow.
But Riker points out the fatal flaw in this strategy. He says seeding the beast only empowers the very entities that inherently despise the patriarchal free market engines that generate the wealth in the first place. You are basically funding your own destruction.
Yeah. Okay, so we have mapped out how the corporate world was legally forced into compliance and how executives enforced these mandates out of fear. But where is the ideological source code coming from?
Good question.
The HR professionals and the C-suite executives, they didn't invent this framework. They absorbed it. So where did they learn to view Western achievement as a crime?
Riker traces the root of this cultural rot directly into the university system, taking the reader all the way back to 1923 in Germany to the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University, Frankfurt.
The famous Frankfurt School?
Yes, the Frankfurt School.
Oh.
Riker argues that Marxist theorists associated with it, men like Herbert Marcuse and Max Horkheimer, they realized early on that their traditional economic class warfare was failing spectacularly.
Because capitalism was working too well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The working class in the West was not going to rise up and destroy Western civilization because Western capitalism was actively making those workers wealthier, healthier, and freer than any other demographic in human history. So Riker claims these theorists purposefully mutated the Marxist framework. They shifted from economic class warfare to cultural and racial warfare. They replaced the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat with the oppressor versus the marginalized. And that mutation eventually birthed what we now call critical race theory and modern gender ideology.
He breaks down the economic illiteracy of this academic framework pretty harshly, focusing on what he calls the zero-sum fallacy of Marxism.
Yeah, the zero-sum fallacy.
This is the ingrained assumption taught in modern universities that all wealth and success are stolen rather than created. The logic dictates that if someone has wealth, or if a society is prosperous, they must have extracted that prosperity from someone else. It views the global economy like a pie of fixed size, like if my slice is big, I must have stolen your portion.
And Riker aggressively counters that fallacy with a concept he calls the architect's prerogative. He demands the reader look at figures like Jack Kilby.
Who is Jack Kilby?
He's the man who invented the integrated circuit microchip. Or look at Nikola Tesla, who developed the alternating current electrical system. Riker argues these men are owed massive, unpayable gratitude for creating an unprecedented surplus of human flourishing.
Because they created something new.
Right. They didn't steal their success from the marginalized. They engineered wealth from absolute nothingness. They expanded the pie infinitely. Yet, Riker points out, Marxist academia insists on framing any civilization built by the intellect of white men as a sprawling crime scene of inherent theft.
He uses a really jarring modern example to prove that this institutional hostility isn't just a fringe theory either, it's publicly funded policy. He dissects an infographic published in the summer of 2020 by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Oh, that infographic.
Yeah. According to Riker's text, this highly respected institution put out a document that pathologized traits like hard work, objective linear thinking, the scientific method, and adherence to rigid time schedules. But it didn't frame them as universal virtues for success. It explicitly labeled them as oppressive aspects of whiteness.
And Riker views this Smithsonian document as the ultimate mask-off moment for the progressive left. He argues it proves they openly despise excellence and competence.
Because they literally published it.
Exactly. By their own admission, they have classified the exact cognitive traits that conquered disease, mapped the genome, and built the industrialized world as a societal disease that needs to be eradicated. He argues this is how modern history is taught to the next generation.
Right.
He contrasts the work of historian Howard Zinn, who Riker claims systematically rewrote American history to paint Western builders as the supreme villains of humanity, with the data-driven work of economist Thomas Sowell. Riker relies heavily on Sowell's book Discrimination and Disparities to systematically dismantle the woke conflation of statistical disparity with systemic discrimination.
How exactly does he use Sowell to disprove that? I mean, what's the data say?
Riker uses Sowell to argue that demanding equal outcomes across different demographics is a mathematical fantasy. Sowell's research proves that outcomes are driven by differences in human capital. So things like median age, cultural emphasis on education, geographical advantages, individual choices.
Okay, so a lot of variables.
Right. Riker uses this data to argue that just because one demographic outperforms another, it is not proof of imaginary systemic oppression. It is proof of superior execution.
Which brings him to Peggy McIntosh and her famous 1988 essay on the invisible knapsack of white privilege. This is a text assigned in almost every freshman sociology class in the country. And man, Riker reserves an incredible amount of venom for her.
He really goes after her.
He mocks McIntosh for sitting in a safe, temperature-controlled, electrically lit ivory tower, a structure built entirely by the sweat and architectural genius of rough-handed men, while having the sheer audacity to judge those exact men and call the structural integrity of the civilization they provided her a privilege.
It's a very vivid image he paints.
When you read his breakdown of the modern university, it feels like he is exposing the ultimate grift. He compares a master electrician, a man who earns a living while learning a vital physical craft, and graduates into the workforce with zero debt.
Yeah.
He compares him to a gender studies graduate drowning in six-figure debt, holding a degree with zero market utility. If you follow Riker's logic, this entire administrative bloat is nothing more than an intellectual protection racket designed to sell federally backed debt-trap degrees to gullible teenagers.
He uses almost that exact phrasing. Riker argues that decades ago, diversity deans and Marxist academics realized their degrees had no actual value in a free market.
Yeah.
You cannot build a bridge or cure a disease with critical theory.
Right.
So to guarantee their own salaries, secure tenure, and expand their institutional power, they manufactured a permanent grievance industry. They exploit susceptible young people, putting them into lifelong financial bondage just to fund a Marxist revolution. And the tragedy, Riker notes, is that these institutions leave the students financially crippled, armed only with toxic theories that don't pay the rent, ensuring they remain angry, dependent foot soldiers for the state.
If you're listening to this and you've recently paid off student loans, that framing is likely going to resonate on a very visceral level.
Oh, for sure.
But Riker doesn't stop at the borders of the American university system. He scales this argument up to the international stage. He argues that this academic framework of original sin isn't just used against men domestically, it is actively exported globally to justify what he calls the greatest attempted wealth transfer in human history.
Yeah, he sets out to completely debunk the stolen wealth narrative of traditional reparations.
This is undoubtedly his most controversial thesis, where he challenges the foundational narrative of modern global justice. Riker argues that the developing world does not just lack a claim for reparations. They actually owe the West an unpayable iron invoice for centuries of technological, medical, and agricultural miracles that they could never have engineered themselves.
And he starts this section with a very specific, stringent legal refutation of traditional reparations based on international law. He brings up the fundamental principle of nullum crimen sine lege.
Meaning no crime without law. So explain how he applies that to historical grievances.
Well, Riker argues that it is a fundamental violation of jurisprudence to retroactively apply modern progressive morality to the 18th or 19th century. He points out that slavery and conquest were virtually universal human practices across all global cultures, continents, and races for the entirety of recorded history up to that point.
Right, everyone was doing it.
Exactly. Therefore, he argues, you cannot demand a modern financial payout for an economic system that was the global baseline, especially when the very people demanding the payout live in a world built on the subsequent wealth generated by Western innovation.
And he pushes the historical envelope even further. He doesn't just excuse the West. He claims the West is uniquely responsible for ending that universal brutality. He argues that it was actually masculine, data-driven logic that finally dismantled the global slave trade, not emotional empathy.
Yeah, he points to the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson.
Clarkson is a fascinating figure for Riker to highlight. Why him?
Riker emphasizes that Clarkson didn't achieve abolition by relying on emotional appeals or progressive sensitivity. He acted like an engineer. Clarkson systematically gathered empirical data, collected shipping logs, acquired the physical tools of bondage to use as evidence, and engineered a massive, highly organized public relations and legal campaign based on hard facts.
So it's a data-driven approach.
Completely. That empirical, relentless force laid the groundwork for the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act in the British Empire. And Riker points out a crucial economic reality. Immediately after abolishing slavery and taking on massive national debt to compensate slave owners to prevent a war, The British economy exploded in wealth.
The Industrial Revolution really took off.
Yes, the Industrial Revolution accelerated. Riker uses this as definitive historical proof that free market innovation and mechanical engineering, not stolen manual labor, are the true bedrock of modern prosperity.
This transitions directly into how Riker calculates his counterclaim. He introduces a concept he calls the technological gift offset. He argues that even if you choose to entertain the idea of a historical debt, the ledgers has been permanently balanced and fundamentally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Western innovations given to the developing world.
And the examples he uses are just staggering in their scale.
He starts with agriculture, bringing up Norman Borlaug, right?
Norman Borlaug, yeah. The American agronomist who won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize. Riker points out that Borlaug developed disease-resistant, high-yield varieties of wheat. By exporting this technology, Borlaug literally saved an estimated 1 billion lives in Mexico, Pakistan, and India.
1 billion.
1 billion. Prevented a global Malthusian collapse. That's a scenario where population growth outpaces agricultural production, leading to massive famine. Riker asks the reader, what is the financial value of 1 billion lives saved by the intellect of a single Western man? How do you calculate that offset?
And he applies the exact same logic to global medicine. He highlights the 1967 intensified smallpox eradication program.
Right, spearheaded by American epidemiologist D.A. Henderson. Riker emphasizes that this initiative was entirely conceived by the West, driven by Western logistics, and funded by over $300 million of Western taxpayer money.
Wow.
Smallpox was a scourge that plagued humanity globally, and it was eradicated by targeted Western intervention. Riker argues the compounding economic benefit to the Third World over the ensuing decades is calculated in the trillions of dollars, a gift of health and economic stability that they lack the scientific infrastructure to achieve independently.
He then moves from biology to the digital realm, citing a very specific date, January 1st, 1983. This is when the ARPANET officially adopted the TCP/IP protocol, which was pioneered by American computer scientists Robert Kahn and Vint Cerf.
The birth of the modern internet.
Exactly. This is essentially the birth of the modern internet. And Riker aggressively rejects the modern narrative that the internet is some kind of shared global commons that belongs to humanity as a whole.
Oh, he finds that concept insulting. Riker claims the internet is the proprietary, conquered digital territory of Western men. He argues that foreign nations and developing economies are currently leeching off digital, financial, and logistical systems. They fundamentally lack the high-level cognitive infrastructure and systemic drive to replicate.
So they're just using a system they could never have built.
Right. They're operating on a grid they did not build and cannot maintain without Western support.
He backs up this claim of a parasitic relationship by citing the grotesque waste of foreign aid when Western oversight is removed. He pulls data from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, reports to prove that pouring money into failed states just doesn't work.
The data points he selects are intentionally staggering to highlight the futility.
What are some of those?
He mentions $85 million of Western taxpayer money pumped into a luxury hotel and command facility in Kabul that sat entirely empty, rotting in the sun. He cites $500 million blown on specialized Italian cargo planes for the Afghan military.
$500 million.
Yes. Because the local forces lacked the technical competence and discipline to maintain them, the planes were immediately grounded, stripped for parts, and eventually turned into literal scrap metal. Riker uses this to forcefully prove his point. These nations fundamentally cannot maintain complex Western technology, and subsidizing them is an exercise in burning capital.
It's important to understand the psychological accusation he's making here, which he calls the gratitude deficit. He claims that activists in developing nations demand reparations not out of a genuine moral quest for historical justice, but as an act of profound psychological projection.
A defense mechanism.
Yes, a defense mechanism. He argues it's a way for failed academics and failed states to mask their own inability to engineer functional societies. He terms this the bottomless pit theory.
Right.
If a society lacks the necessary cognitive, cultural, and disciplinary infrastructure to maintain a high-tech civilization, pouring financial resources into it is just throwing wealth into a bottomless pit. The problem isn't a lack of money. The problem is a lack of masculine systemic competence.
This raises a massive structural question in Riker's framework. If this aggressive, highly competent patriarchal structure is exactly what built the modern world and saved humanity from disease and famine, What happens when a society decides to actively erase the biological realities that underpin that structure?
That's the logical bridge into his chapters on evolutionary biology and what he calls the queer eradication of the patriarch. Riker asserts that biological dominance, physical dimorphism, and patriarchy are unalterable evolutionary imperatives, not flimsy social constructs that can be legislated away.
Right, and to prove the danger of treating biology as a social construct, he points back to the horrific experiments conducted in the 1950s and 60s by the psychologist John Money. For listeners unfamiliar with this case, it is one of the darkest chapters in modern psychology, and Riker uses it as the ultimate proof of academic hubris.
Yeah, tell us about John Money.
So, John Money operated on the radical theory that gender was entirely a social construct. He believed that human beings were blank slates, and that a person's gender identity could be engineered at will through environmental conditioning and surgery.
Okay.
Riker details the deeply tragic case of David Reimer, a twin boy who suffered a botched circumcision in infancy.
Yeah.
Money convinced Reimer's parents to let him surgically alter David into a female, rename him Brenda, and socially condition him to live as a girl.
It's awful.
Money subjected David to highly abusive, coercive psychological sessions to force this identity upon him.
And Money published papers for years claiming it was a massive success, which laid the foundation for modern gender theory. But it was a complete fraud.
It was a catastrophic failure. David Reimer never identified as a girl, suffered immense psychological torment, eventually demanded to live as a male once he learned the truth, and tragically ended up committing suicide as an adult. Riker argues that this case proves biological reality is innate and permanent, but his deeper indictment is that instead of academia admitting defeat and acknowledging the permanence of biology, modern progressive institutions buried this failure and weaponized Money's fraudulent, abusive concepts into mainstream cultural policy.
He is incredibly critical of how the left weaponizes what he calls feminine compassion against objective biological logic. And he looks at the modern inclusion of biological men in female sports and female-only spaces to illustrate this.
Right.
Riker views this as the ultimate ideological betrayal by radical feminists. He argues it proves they hate the strong, protective patriarchal order so deeply that they would rather hand over their bathrooms, domestic abuse shelters, and hard-won athletic medals to physically dominant biological males than ever admit that the protective boundaries of biological reality are permanent and necessary.
He points to the legal manifestation of this erasure, focusing his ire on the 2020 Supreme Court decision in Bostock v. Clayton County.
What happened there?
Riker accuses Justice Neil Gorsuch and the majority of executing a bloodless Marxist legal coup. In that decision, the court redefined the word sex in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to include the modern manufactured concept of gender identity.
I see.
Riker argues the court took a statute specifically designed to protect biological women from systemic discrimination and turned it into a legal sword for radical gender ideology, effectively obliterating the legal basis for female-only spaces and erasing the biological definition of men and women.
But Riker doesn't just rely on analyzing legal betrayals, right? He pulls heavily from anthropology to argue that male dominance is hardwired into the human species. He openly mocks the progressive academic fantasy of peaceful historical matriarchy.
Oh yeah, he brings up the Minangkabau people of Indonesia as a prime example. Progressive anthropologists often champion them as a rare egalitarian matrilineal utopia.
But Riker disagrees.
Completely. He points out a glaring omission in those studies. Even in that society, the men still exclusively handle the brutal physical realities of politics, negotiation, and warfare. He argues this proves that when the threat of violence looms, the patriarchal hierarchy remains undefeated no matter what the cultural narrative is.
He pairs that with Napoleon Chagnon's controversial but foundational anthropological data regarding the Yanomamo tribes in the Amazon. Chagnon's research demonstrated that male warriors who engage in assertive, aggressive protection of their tribe are biologically rewarded.
Yes.
They have a higher status, more wives, and more offspring. They are genetically essential to the survival of their people. Riker contrasts this undeniable historical evolutionary reality with the fiction produced by what he calls the modern media matrix.
This is where he dissects the modern sitcom dad trope. If you've watched a commercial or a sitcom in the last 20 years, you know exactly what he's talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
Riker notes a highly coordinated, deliberate shift in primetime television and advertising over the last few decades. He argues that white working-class men have been systematically reduced to two weaponized tropes.
Which are?
They are either portrayed as bumbling, pathetic buffoons who cannot operate a dishwasher, or manage their own children without a hyper-competent, eye-rolling female swooping in to save them, or if they display any actual authority, they are portrayed as violent, aggressive sociopaths.
It's one extreme or the other.
Right. Riker argues this is not an accident. It is a deliberate psychological cultural operation designed to mock, belittle, and pathologize raw masculine authority in the minds of the next generation.
He counters this media narrative by bringing in hard science, specifically citing research from Cambridge University by Simon Baron-Cohen regarding the extreme male brain.
Yeah, that research is really interesting.
Baron-Cohen's data suggests that the male genetic profile exposed to fetal testosterone is uniquely wired for systemizing behaviors. This means men are biologically driven to analyze, construct, organize, and conquer the natural world based on strict rules and logic.
Let me pose a question here, thinking about Riker's timeline of human achievement.
Go ahead.
If high systemic testosterone drove the extreme spatial awareness, risk-taking, and logistical mastery necessary to build the massive architectural wonders of Göbekli Tepe around 9000 BCE, structures that required immense physical sacrifice and engineering genius before the invention of the wheel.
Yeah.
How can modern society possibly survive if it actively chemically medicates young boys in classrooms for acting like boys and legislates against the exact systemic traits that built the world?
Well, Riker's blunt answer is that a society that does that cannot survive. It is living on borrowed time. Which brings us to his analysis of the physical, undeniable consequences of removing this biological masculine order. He turns his attention to the visible decay of our modern cities and our legal systems. Riker argues that civilization is not a natural state of being. It is merely a thin, fragile veneer maintained entirely by the implicit threat of masculine force and order. When you remove that force in the name of compassion, you guarantee a progressive dystopia.
Let's examine the legal side of that decay first, starting with the family unit. He explores what he calls the legal double standard, specifically focusing on the corruption of family courts.
Right?
He traces the legal presumption of maternal superiority, the idea that children always belong with the mother, all the way back to an early feminist named Caroline Norton, and the implementation of the 1839 Tender Years Doctrine.
What was the standard before that?
Before 1839, English common law recognized the father as the undisputed, absolute head of his family, holding custody and responsibility for his children. Caroline Norton successfully lobbied the state to shift the legal default of custody to the mother. Riker claims this was the moment an insidious bias was embedded into Western jurisprudence, fracturing the patriarchal family unit. He pairs this historical legal shift with the biological reality of modern reproductive choice.
And what's his argument there?
Riker makes a very stark argument. He states that if a woman unilaterally holds the legal and biological power of abortion, adoption, or safe haven laws, meaning she has total reproductive choice, then forcing a man into an 18-year financial indentured servitude through child support for a child he never consented to have is the ultimate expression of systemic tyranny.
Wow.
He argues it reduces men from patriarchs to state-enforced ATMs.
He then expands that argument, claiming that the exact same progressive compassion that corrupted the family courts and stripped men of their authority is exactly what is rotting our major cities from the inside out. He points to a very specific piece of legislation in California, the 1967 Landrigan-Petra Short Act.
Yeah, the Landrigan-Petra Short Act was a landmark piece of patients' rights legislation. Its intent was to end the inappropriate, indefinite commitment of people with mental health disorders.
Right, which sounds compassionate.
But in practice, it made it incredibly difficult for the state to involuntarily commit the severely mentally ill or dangerous individuals. Riker argues that this specific act, driven by naive, progressive compassion, effectively emptied the state asylums directly onto the streets of major cities.
Just emptied them out.
Yes. He claims it established a legal framework that prioritizes the rights of the deranged, the violent, and the addicted over the rights of the honorable builder, the taxpayer, and the family man who just wants to walk his children down a clean, safe street.
He provides a staggering visual contrast to drive this point home, too. He asks the reader to mentally teleport themselves to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which is known as the White City.
Right.
He describes it as a pristine, unapologetically patriarchal monument to Western achievement built by visionary patriarchs like Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted. It was safe, immaculate, and technologically breathtaking. Then he says to look at the post-industrial, rotting, dangerous wasteland of modern Detroit.
Yeah, that contrast is sharp.
He attributes Detroit's fall from being the arsenal of democracy directly to the systematic stripping of its masculine industrial base, and the implementation of progressive social policies that tolerate crime and decay.
And to stop this decay, Riker demands a return to aggressive, unapologetic law enforcement. He champions William Bratton's 1990s broken windows policing strategy in New York City.
Broken windows, yeah.
Riker argues that strategy thrived and cleaned up the city precisely because it relied entirely on masculine authority. It treated minor infractions, turnstile jumping, vandalism, public intoxication with the strict physical severity they deserved.
Right.
Riker argues this proves that what he calls the feral underclass respects nothing but a firm masculine hand, and that compassion is interpreted purely as weakness to be exploited.
He also celebrates the 2022 Supreme Court victory in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. He frames the striking down of New York's subjective proper cause requirement for concealed carry not just as a Second Amendment victory, but as a massive cultural victory restoring the fundamental patriarchal right for a man to defend his territory and his family in a decaying society.
Which perfectly sets up his critique of the elite class, a concept he calls the gated utopian paradox.
Oh, I love this part. Tell him about the gated utopian paradox.
Well, he points out the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of coastal elites. He names politicians like Nancy Pelosi and progressive prosecutors who advocate for defunding the police, emptying prisons, and creating a defenseless, egalitarian society for the working class.
Yeah.
Yet Riker observes these exact same elites cower behind fortified, gated compounds, employing armed private security details. He uses the architectural metaphor of crenellation, the battlements on top of a castle designed to shield archers.
Right, the defenses.
He says these elites hoard the patriarchal protection of armed men for themselves, retreating behind their modern crenellations while leaving the working class entirely exposed to the urban jungle they created.
So, with the problem fully mapped out in exhaustive detail from the corporate boardroom and the university to the family court and the streets of our decaying cities, what is the author's actionable solution? Where does this all lead? Riker concludes the book with an uncompromising ultimatum to his readers. He calls for a full-scale intellectual and economic strike, an unapologetic declaration of patriarchal independence.
Yeah, he tells men to stop playing a game where the rules are rigged against them.
Yeah.
He literally instructs men to comprehensively withdraw their consent, their labor, and what he calls their unearned subsidies from a society that actively seeks their destruction.
Right.
He argues that society functions only because competent men subsidize the incompetence of everyone else. It is time to cut off the supply.
His tactical advice for how to do this is very specific, starting with interpersonal dynamics. In debates or HR meetings, he instructs men to execute what he calls the aggression flip.
Aggression flip.
When you are accused of toxic masculinity or being too aggressive, he says you must never, ever apologize. Instead, you go on the offensive. Point to historical realities like the Selective Service Act of 1917, where millions of young men were drafted to bleed to death in the mud of Europe to protect the nation. Right. Demand the progressive HR rep explain exactly who is supposed to defend civilization and do the dying if not aggressive men. Frame their safety as a luxury bought by the very toxicity they condemn.
He also advises utilizing a psychological tactic he calls amused mastery.
Amused mastery?
Yeah. When faced with progressive hysterics, he tells men to treat the activist like a toddler throwing a tantrum in a supermarket. Refuse to validate their vocabulary. Do not acknowledge pseudo-psychological terminology about triggers, microaggressions, or boundaries.
Just ignore it.
Treat their emotional fragility with a smirk, utterly denying them the authority to govern your behavior. And on a macro level, he tells his readers to starve the enemy financially. Cancel all corporate media subscriptions. Utilize ad blockers and VPNs to block digital tracking cookies so tech companies cannot monetize your data, and completely abandon woke financial platforms like PayPal or Patreon that have a history of freezing the accounts of dissidents who challenge progressive orthodoxy.
And he pushes for the creation of completely parallel economies. If the mainstream economy is hostile, build your own. He advises utilizing decentralized cryptocurrency to move assets outside the traditional banking system.
Establish localized, barter-based trade networks with other like-minded men.
Exactly. And legally protecting your hard-earned assets using Nevada or Delaware domestic asset protection trusts. He argues these specific legal instruments are designed to legally strip misandrist family courts and progressive civil litigators of their ability to seize your wealth. He wants his readers completely insulated from the state.
And he bundles all of these tactics under the umbrella of adopting the battleship mindset.
The battleship mindset.
This is a holistic approach to physical and mental fortification. It involves eating a primal carnivorous diet to naturally boost testosterone and physical vitality, aggressively lifting heavy objects to build physical presence, and refusing to consume modern pop culture.
So what should they consume instead?
He tells men to engage only with primary historical texts, reading Marcus Aurelius, reading the Founding Fathers. The goal is to build a psychological armor that is entirely immune to what he terms the fragility projection principle.
The fragility projection principle.
That's the tactic where progressive crybullies claim to be victims in order to wield tyrannical power over you.
You know, when you step back and look at the sheer scale of this ultimatum, it really makes you wonder about the core foundational logic of his threat. Riker is essentially saying that the gears of civilization, the high-voltage power grids, the global supply chains, the integrated circuits, the structural integrity of our bridges are held together by the sweat, intellect, and tolerance of a very small, very specific demographic of competent men.
Yeah.
If they truly heed his call, if they execute this intellectual and economic strike on a mass scale, withdrawing their capital and their labor to parallel enclaves, does the whole global machine just grind to a halt?
That is the exact unvarnished threat he is making at the end of the book. He firmly believes the ungrateful masses owe a debt they can never possibly repay. And until society submits, acknowledges the biological reality of patriarchy, and pays the iron invoice with the respect he demands, he is advising the architects of the world to simply shut off the power and let the system collapse.
Well, that brings us to the end of a truly intense, dense exploration. To briefly recap what we've unpacked over the last hour, we have walked through Conrad Riker's uncompromising vision in Reparations Now. We've explored his total rejection of the victimhood industrial complex, analyzed his arguments for the deep evolutionary roots of patriarchal power, and detailed his demand that the globe acknowledge and pay its iron invoice to Western men for engineering the technological and medical miracles of the modern world.
And we must reiterate clearly, as we close this deep dive, that we have been analyzing the intense, highly polarizing arguments of Conrad Riker's text. We are not endorsing these political or social viewpoints.
Right.
We have simply provided a comprehensive, impartial breakdown of the concepts exactly as they are presented by the author in the book, allowing you to understand the architecture of his claims.
Absolutely. We promised an objective dissection, and that is what we delivered. If you found this deep dive valuable and thought-provoking, please take a second to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And again, if you want to read the source material and judge the evidence for yourself, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Reparations Now.
You can follow the author's ongoing writing at Conrad Riker on Substack, hit him up on Twitter at Conrad Riker, and check out his video content on his YouTube channel at Conrad Riker.
We covered a tremendous amount of ground today, analyzing centuries of history and law, but in a framework this massive, there's always more to critically examine. And we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something building on Riker's concepts that we didn't explicitly answer today. If Riker's vision of a patriarchal independence and a complete systemic withdrawal of male capital and labor were actually achieved on a mass scale, would the globalist system simply collapse quietly under its own weight as he predicts? Or would the state, facing its own imminent destruction, initiate an unprecedented, forceful confrontation to physically extract the labor and genius it can no longer survive without? Think about that. Thanks for listening.